The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in January, just after the biggest snowstorm Milwaukee had seen in 15 years, and I knew immediately it was going to ruin my week. I stood in my driveway, coffee in one hand and the thick envelope in the other, watching my breath cloud in the frigid air. My name, Isaac Emerson, was printed in bold letters across the front, along with an official-looking stamp from the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association. I had been living in this subdivision for 3 years, and every interaction with the HOA had been progressively worse than the last. The snow had stopped falling 2 days ago, leaving nearly 18 inches blanketing everything. I had dutifully shoveled my driveway and sidewalk, salted the walkway to my front door, and even cleared a path to my mailbox. My back was still sore from the effort, but I had done everything required of me according to the HOA bylaws I had reluctantly reviewed when I bought the house. I tore open the envelope as I walked back inside, tracking snow across my entryway. The letter was typed on official letterhead with the HOA logo at the top, a ridiculous design featuring a house inside a circle of trees that looked like it had been made in Microsoft Paint circa 1995. Dear Mr. Emerson, it began. It has come to the attention of the Riverside Meadows HOA board that you have failed to comply with snow removal requirements as outlined in Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the updated community guidelines distributed in November 2024. I stopped reading and grabbed my phone, pulling up the email from November. I had read those guidelines carefully because the HOA president, a woman named Patricia Brennan, had a reputation for being unreasonable. I scanned through the document until I found Section 12, Paragraph 4. It covered standard snow removal from driveways, walkways, and sidewalks adjacent to properties. Nothing I had not already done. I returned to the letter. Specifically, you have neglected to clear snow from the fire hydrant located at the corner of your property at 2847 Riverside Drive. This violation poses a serious safety hazard and must be remedied within 48 hours of receipt of this notice. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $150, with an additional $50 per day until the violation is corrected. The HOA reserves the right to hire contractors to complete the work and bill you for services rendered, plus administrative fees. I walked to my front window and looked out at the corner of my property. Sure enough, there was a fire hydrant buried under snow, barely visible except for the very top of its red cap. I had never even considered it my responsibility. In fact, I was pretty sure it was not. My phone buzzed. It was my neighbor, Gerald Martinez, who lived 2 doors down. "Did you get the letter?" he asked when I answered. "About the fire hydrants." "Yeah, just opened it." "This is insane, Isaac. She sent them to everyone who has a hydrant near their property. That is 6 houses on this street alone." I called the city, and they said clearing hydrants is a municipal responsibility. The fire department does it, not homeowners. Are you serious? Dead serious. I talked to a guy named Robert in the Public Works Department. He said residents can clear them if they want to help out, but it is absolutely not required, and no HOA can mandate it. I felt my jaw clench. So Patricia just made up a new rule. Looks like it. What are you going to do? I'm going to call her right now. Good luck. I tried that already. She told me to read the bylaws and hung up on me. After Gerald hung up, I found Patricia's number in my HOA directory. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice syrupy sweet in a way that immediately set my teeth on edge. Riverside Meadows HOA, Patricia speaking. How may I help you? Patricia, this is Isaac Emerson from Riverside Drive. I just got your letter about clearing the fire hydrant. Oh, wonderful. I am so glad you are taking this seriously, Mr. Emerson. Public safety is everyone's responsibility. That is the thing, Patricia. I checked with the city, and clearing fire hydrants is a municipal responsibility, not a homeowner responsibility. The fire department handles it. There was a pause. When she spoke again, the sweetness had evaporated. Mr. Emerson, the HOA has the authority to implement rules that exceed municipal requirements when it comes to safety and aesthetics. This is clearly outlined in the covenant agreements you signed when you purchased your home. I read my covenant agreements very carefully. There is nothing about fire hydrants. The board has the authority to update community standards as needed. This was voted on and approved in our December meeting. What meeting? I did not get any notice about a meeting. All meeting notices are posted on the community website 14 days in advance, as required. I pulled up the HOA website on my laptop while keeping her on the phone. The site looked like it had not been updated since 2019. I clicked through to the meetings section and found exactly one post about a December meeting, dated December 28th at 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday. Most people would have been at work or traveling for the holidays. Patricia, you scheduled a meeting for the day after Christmas in the middle of a workday. That is not reasonable notice. The bylaws do not specify what constitutes reasonable notice beyond the 14-day requirement, which we met. If you have concerns about HOA procedures, you are welcome to attend the next board meeting and voice them during the public comment period. When is the next meeting? March 15th. That is almost 2 months away. You are threatening to fine me $150 starting in 2 days, and I cannot even address it until March. The fine structure is clearly outlined in the letter. You have 48 hours to comply. Have a blessed day, Mr. Emerson. She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, staring at my phone, feeling my blood pressure spike. This was exactly the kind of petty tyranny that made HOAs infamous. Patricia Brennan had decided to create a new rule with no legitimate authority, scheduled a meeting when she knew most residents could not attend, and was now threatening fines for not complying with a requirement that was not even our legal responsibility. I called the Milwaukee Fire Department non-emergency line. A dispatcher put me through to Captain Andrews in the fire marshal's office. Captain Andrews, this is Isaac Emerson. I live in the Riverside Meadows subdivision and I have kind of an unusual situation. Go ahead. I explained the letter and Patricia's demand. There was a long silence on the other end. Mr. Emerson, clearing fire hydrants is absolutely a city responsibility, not a private citizen's responsibility. In fact, we have crews that do this specifically after major snow events. We already cleared most of the hydrants in your area yesterday. If one got missed, give me the address and I will send someone out today. So the HOA cannot require me to do this. Not legally, no. They can encourage residents to help keep hydrants clear, and we always appreciate when community members pitch in, but it is not something that can be mandated or fined. That hydrant is city property on a city easement. The HOA has no authority over it. Would you be willing to put that in writing? The HOA president is threatening fines if I do not comply within 48 hours. Absolutely. Give me your email address. I will send you a formal statement. And honestly, Mr. Emerson, you might want to contact the city attorney's office. If your HOA is trying to fine residents for not maintaining city property, that is a problem. I thanked Captain Andrews and gave him my email address. Within 20 minutes, I had an official letter from the Milwaukee Fire Department on city letterhead explaining that fire hydrant maintenance and snow removal was a municipal function, and that private citizens had no legal obligation to clear them. Armed with this document, I forwarded it to Patricia with a polite but firm email stating that I would not be clearing the fire hydrant as it was not my legal responsibility, and that any fines issued would be contested. Her response came 30 minutes later. Mr. Emerson, what the city requires and what the HOA requires are two separate matters. The HOA has the authority to maintain community standards beyond minimum legal requirements. Your failure to comply will result in fines as outlined. This is your final warning. I forwarded the entire email chain to Gerald, who replied with a string of expletives and a suggestion that we both attend the March HOA meeting prepared to challenge the board. The 48 hours passed. I did not shovel the fire hydrant. On Thursday morning, I received another certified letter informing me that I was being fined $150 for non-compliance, with an additional $50 per day until the violation was corrected. I called a lawyer that afternoon. His name was Marcus Chen, and he specialized in property law and HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Milwaukee, and he agreed to see me the next day. Marcus's office was small but professionally decorated, with shelves lined with legal textbooks and several framed diplomas on the walls. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that suggested he did not miss much. "Tell me everything," he said after we shook hands. I walked him through the timeline. The letter, my conversation with the fire department, Patricia's responses, and the fine I had received. I brought copies of everything, including the fire department's letter. Marcus reviewed the documents carefully, making notes on a legal pad. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and folded his hands. "Okay, the good news is you have a strong case here. The HOA is clearly overstepping its authority by attempting to enforce responsibility for city property. The bad news is that fighting this is going to take time and probably some money. How much are we talking? Depends on how hard they fight back. If they are reasonable and back down once I send them a letter explaining the legal situation, maybe a couple $100 for my time. If they dig in and we have to take this to court, it could be several thousand." I felt my stomach sink. Several $1,000s over a fire hydrant I legally do not have to shovel. Unfortunately, yes. HOA disputes can get expensive fast. These organizations often have legal funds specifically for fighting homeowners, and some board members see these conflicts as personal crusades. From what you have told me about Patricia Brennan, she sounds like the type who will not back down easily. What do you recommend? Let me send her a formal letter outlining the legal issues and giving her a chance to withdraw the fine. If she refuses, we can file a complaint with the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions, which oversees HOAs. We can also sue the HOA for harassment and for attempting to collect fines for something outside their jurisdiction. The fire department's letter is excellent evidence. Do it. Send the letter. Marcus drafted a letter that afternoon. It was 3 pages of dense legal language that boiled down to, "You have no authority to fine my client for not maintaining city property. Withdraw the fine immediately or face legal action." He sent it via certified mail and email. Patricia's response came 2 days later, and it was not what we hoped for. "Mr. Chen, the Riverside Meadows HOA board has reviewed your letter and stands by its decision. The community covenants grant the board broad authority to maintain safety standards, and clearing fire hydrants falls under this umbrella. Mr. Emerson's fine stands, and the daily penalties continue to accrue. If Mr. Emerson wishes to dispute this decision, He may do so at the March 15th board meeting or through binding arbitration as outlined in the community covenants. Regards, Patricia Brennan, HOA President. Marcus shook his head when he showed me the response. She is either incredibly stubborn or incredibly stupid, possibly both. What is this about binding arbitration? A lot of HOA agreements include clauses requiring arbitration before legal action can be taken. Let me check your covenants. He pulled up my purchase documents and spent 15 minutes reading through the fine print. Okay, there is an arbitration clause, but it is not mandatory. It says disputes may be resolved through arbitration, not must be. That gives us options. So we can sue. We can, but let me try the Department of Financial Institutions first. Filing a complaint is free, and they have authority to investigate HOAs that are overstepping their bounds. It might take a few months, but it could resolve this without costing you thousands in legal fees. I agreed, and Marcus filed the complaint that week. In the meantime, the daily fines continued to accumulate. By the end of January, the HOA claimed I owed $900. I started documenting everything. I took photos of the fire hydrant with timestamps, showing that the city fire department had eventually cleared it themselves without any action from me. I saved every email from Patricia, every letter, every piece of correspondence. I also started attending city council meetings, where I discovered I was not the only person having problems with the Riverside Meadows HOA. At a meeting in early February, a woman named Susan Torres stood up during the public comment period and described how the HOA had fined her $500 for painting her front door navy blue instead of the approved colonial blue. Another resident, James Walsh, talked about being fined for parking his work truck in his own driveway because it had a company logo on the side. After the meeting, several of us gathered in the parking lot. There were 8 people total, all with similar stories of Patricia Brennan and the HOA board running roughshod over reasonable homeowner rights. We should organize, Susan said. There are 53 homes in Riverside Meadows. If even half of us band together, we could recall the board. The covenants allow for that, I asked. I checked, James said. We need signatures from 60% of homeowners to force a recall election. That is 32 households. Between all of us here and our neighbors, I bet we can get that. We formed what we half-jokingly called the Riverside Meadows Homeowner Defense Committee. Over the next 3 weeks, we went door to door, talking to neighbors, collecting stories, and gathering signatures. The response was overwhelming. It turned out Patricia had made enemies all over the neighborhood with her endless rules and arbitrary fines. We collected 40 signatures, well over the required threshold. James compiled everything into a formal petition and submitted it to the HOA board on February 28th, requesting a recall election for all board members. Patricia's response was swift and predictable. She sent a mass email to all Riverside Meadows residents claiming that a small group of malcontents was trying to undermine the HOA's efforts to maintain property values and community standards. She accused us by name of being troublemakers who wanted to turn the neighborhood into a lawless wasteland. The email was so over the top that it actually helped our cause. Several residents who had been on the fence about the recall were offended by Patricia's tone and added their signatures to our petition. By law, the HOA had to hold the recall election within 30 days of receiving a valid petition. Patricia scheduled it for March 29th, 2 weeks after the regular board meeting where I had planned to address the fire hydrant issue. The March 15th meeting was held in the community center, a small building at the entrance to our subdivision. I arrived early with Marcus, Gerald, and several other members of our defense committee. The room was packed. I had never seen this many neighbors in one place. Patricia sat at a table at the front with the other board members. Her vice president, Dennis Hoffman, a retired accountant who nodded along with everything Patricia said, and the secretary, Rachel Moore, a quiet woman in her 30s who always looked uncomfortable during confrontations. Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. She went through standard business first, approving minutes from the previous meeting and discussing landscaping contracts for the common areas. When she reached the public comment section, her expression tightened. We will now hear from residents who have signed up to speak. Each person has 3 minutes. First up is Isaac Emerson. I walked to the podium set up in front of the board table. I had prepared remarks, but I also had a stack of documents I planned to reference. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Isaac Emerson, and I live on Riverside Drive. In January, I received a letter from the HOA demanding that I clear snow from the fire hydrant near my property. I contacted the Milwaukee Fire Department, who confirmed in writing that clearing fire hydrants is a municipal responsibility, not a homeowner responsibility. I shared this information with Patricia Brennan, but the HOA issued me a fine anyway. That fine has now accumulated to over $1,200 with daily penalties. I held up the fire department's letter. This is official correspondence from Captain Andrews of the Fire Marshal's office, stating clearly that the HOA has no authority to require residents to maintain city property. Despite this, the HOA has continued to assess fines. This is not just unfair, it is likely illegal. I am here tonight to request that the board immediately withdraw all fines related to fire hydrant maintenance and cease this policy. Patricia did not even look at the letter. Mr. Emerson, as I have explained to you multiple times, the HOA has authority to implement safety standards that exceed minimum municipal requirements. The board stands by its decision. Your fines remain in effect, even though what you are requiring is literally not my legal responsibility. The board's decision is final. Next speaker, please. I returned to my seat, frustrated but not surprised. Gerald spoke next, delivering similar testimony about his own fines. Then Susan, then James. Speaker after speaker stood up and described Patricia's overreach and arbitrary enforcement of rules throughout it all. Patricia sat stone-faced, dismissing each concern with variations of the same response. The board's decision is final. Read the covenants, comply, or face fines. By the end of the public comment period, the tension in the room was palpable. Several people were openly angry, and I could see Rachel Moore looking increasingly distressed. When the meeting adjourned, Marcus pulled me aside. That went about how I expected. She is not going to budge. We need to escalate. What do you recommend? I am going to file a lawsuit on your behalf against the HOA for harassment and for attempting to collect fines outside their authority. I will also file an emergency motion to stop the collection of additional fines while the case is pending. This is going to get messy, Isaac. I do not care. She cannot be allowed to do this. Marcus filed the lawsuit 3 days later. The local news picked up the story because a reporter named Jennifer Scott happened to live in a neighboring subdivision and had heard about our HOA disputes. She called me for an interview, and I agreed to talk to her. The article ran on March 22nd under the headline, "Milwaukee HOA Battle Escalates Over Fire Hydrant Dispute." Jennifer did excellent work, interviewing me, Marcus, Captain Andrews from the fire department, and several other affected homeowners. She even tried to interview Patricia, who declined and instead sent a written statement about the HOA's commitment to safety and property values. The article sparked a broader conversation about HOA overreach. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel picked it up. Then a local TV station sent a crew to interview me in front of the infamous fire hydrant. The story went viral on social media, with people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Patricia was furious. She sent a cease and desist letter to me through her own lawyer, claiming I was defaming the HOA and damaging the community's reputation. Marcus responded with a letter explaining that truth is an absolute defense against defamation, and that I had done nothing but state facts. The recall election was held on March 29th as scheduled. The turnout was unprecedented. 47 of the 53 households sent representatives to vote. When the results were tallied, Patricia Brennan, Dennis Hoffman, and Rachel Moore had all been recalled by overwhelming margins. Rachel actually looked relieved. Temporary board members were appointed that night to serve until a regular election could be held in May. The first thing they did was pass a motion to rescind all fines related to fire hydrant maintenance and to cease requiring homeowners to clear hydrants. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Patricia refused to accept the recall results. She sent emails claiming the election had been invalid due to procedural irregularities that she could not specify. She showed up at the temporary board's first meeting and attempted to take her seat at the table, arguing that she was still the legitimate president. Building security had to escort her out. She stood in the parking lot screaming about coups and conspiracies while someone filmed her on their phone. That video also went viral. Marcus called me the next morning. "Isaac, we have a problem. Patricia filed a counter-suit against you personally, claiming you orchestrated a harassment campaign against her and damaged her reputation. You have got to be kidding me." I wish I was. Her lawyer is arguing that you used the media to defame her, and that you coordinated the recall effort as retaliation for legitimate HOA enforcement actions. It is completely frivolous, but we are going to have to respond to it. Can she do that? She can file whatever she wants. The question is whether it will survive a motion to dismiss. I am confident it will not, but it is going to cost you some legal fees to fight it. The countersuit was the last straw for many residents. Even people who had been neutral in the conflict were appalled that Patricia was now going after individual homeowners with personal lawsuits. The story got more media coverage. A legal expert interviewed on the local news described Patricia's suit as a slap suit, a strategic lawsuit against public participation designed to intimidate critics into silence. Wisconsin had anti-slap laws that could force Patricia to pay my legal fees if the suit was dismissed, which gave me some hope. My original lawsuit against the HOA moved forward. We had a hearing in Milwaukee County Circuit Court in April before Judge Richard Walsh. Marcus presented our case clearly. The HOA had attempted to fine me for not maintaining city property, something I had no legal obligation to do, and had continued to assess fines even after being shown official documentation from the fire department. The HOA's lawyer, a nervous young man named Trevor who seemed deeply uncomfortable with his client, argued that the covenants gave the board broad discretionary authority to implement safety measures. Judge Walsh was not impressed. "Counselor, the board's authority is not unlimited. They cannot require residents to maintain property they do not own and are not legally responsible for. The fire department's letter makes it clear that clearing fire hydrants is a city function. Does your client dispute that?" Trevor shuffled his papers. "Your Honor, the HOA's position is that while the city has primary responsibility, homeowners can be required to assist with safety measures near their property." Can be required by whom? On what legal basis? The covenants grant the board authority to implement rules for community safety and welfare. Show me where in the covenants it says the board can force homeowners to maintain city property. Trevor could not, because no such provision existed. Judge Walsh ruled from the bench, finding that the HOA had exceeded its authority and ordering them to refund all fines collected from me, and to cease enforcement of the fire hydrant policy. He also awarded me attorney's fees, which came to about $3,500. I should have felt victorious, but the stress of the entire ordeal had taken its toll. I was exhausted, angry, and increasingly worried about Patricia's counter-suit against me personally. That worry intensified when I learned that Patricia had filed similar suits against Gerald and Susan, the other two most vocal critics of her board. Her strategy seemed to be to punish anyone who had opposed her, regardless of the merits of the cases. Marcus filed a motion to dismiss the suit against me under Wisconsin's anti-SLAPP statute. He argued that my statements to the media were protected speech on a matter of public concern, and that Patricia could not demonstrate any likelihood of success on the merits of her defamation claim. The hearing on that motion was scheduled for May 15th. In the meantime, the regular HOA board election was held, and a slate of reasonable candidates won all the positions. The new board immediately began reviewing Patricia's tenure and discovered serious financial irregularities. It turned out Patricia had been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, including her legal fees for the suits against homeowners. She had also approved payments to her brother's landscaping company at rates well above market value. The total amount of misappropriated funds appeared to be around $35,000. The new board filed a police report. The Milwaukee Police Department assigned a detective named Lisa Morrison to investigate. Detective Morrison contacted me and several other homeowners as part of her investigation. Mr. Emerson, I have reviewed the financial records provided by the new HOA board. Can you tell me about your interactions with Miss Brennan? I walked her through the entire timeline, providing copies of all correspondence. Detective Morrison took detailed notes. This is consistent with what I am hearing from others. It appears Miss Brennan may have misused her position for personal gain and retaliation. I am going to recommend charges to the district attorney's office. What kind of charges? Likely theft by fraud for the misappropriation of HOA funds, and possibly abuse of process for the retaliatory lawsuits. The DA will make the final call. 2 weeks later, Patricia Brennan was arrested at her home and charged with theft, misconduct in public office, and abuse of process. The arrest was covered extensively in local media, with reporters noting the connection to the fire hydrant dispute that had sparked the investigation. The charges against Patricia were serious enough that she was looking at potential jail time if convicted. Her lawyer negotiated a plea deal where she would plead guilty to theft and misconduct charges, in exchange for dropping the abuse of process charge, and a recommendation for probation, instead of incarceration. As part of the plea deal, Patricia had to withdraw all pending lawsuits against homeowners and agree to repay the HOA $35,000 for the misappropriated funds. She also had to resign from any HOA positions permanently and complete 200 hours of community service. The judge accepted the plea deal at a hearing in June. Patricia stood before the court looking pale and diminished, nothing like the imperious HOA president who had made so many of our lives miserable. She mumbled her acceptance of the terms and was led away to be processed for probation. I attended the hearing with Gerald and Susan. Afterward, we stood on the courthouse steps, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Is it really over?" Susan asked. "I think so," I said. Finally. The new HOA board was everything Patricia's board had not been. They communicated clearly with residents, held meetings at convenient times, and focused on actual community improvement rather than petty rule enforcement. They revised the community guidelines to remove arbitrary restrictions and clarified that homeowners were only responsible for maintaining their own property, not city infrastructure. The fire hydrant fine policy was formally abolished, and the board sent a letter to all residents apologizing for the previous board's overreach. They also implemented new financial controls to prevent future misappropriation of funds. By summer, life in Riverside Meadows had returned to something approaching normal. The constant tension that had defined the community under Patricia's leadership had dissipated. People actually started attending HOA meetings because they were productive rather than combative. I ran into Gerald one evening in July while we were both mowing our lawns. He waved and walked over, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Can you believe how different things are now?" he said. "It's night and day." I actually got a friendly reminder about trimming my hedges instead of a threatening letter with fine schedules. Gerald laughed. "Right. And when I called to ask about the timeline, someone actually explained it politely instead of telling me to read the bylaws." We stood there in the warm evening air, listening to cicadas and the distant sound of children playing. It felt like a normal neighborhood again. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you had just shoveled that hydrant?" Gerald asked. "All the time. But then she would have moved on to the next arbitrary rule and the next fine. Someone had to push back. I am glad it was you, and that you did not back down. I thought about that a lot over the following months. The entire ordeal had cost me time, money, stress, and more than a few sleepless nights. But it had also brought the community together and exposed serious corruption that might have continued for years if no one had challenged Patricia's authority. The lawsuit had been resolved in my favor, with the HOA paying my attorney's fees as ordered by the court. I actually ended up slightly ahead financially after the fine refund, though that hardly seemed like the point. More importantly, the experience had taught me something about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. Patricia had counted on people being too intimidated or too exhausted to fight back. For years, that strategy had worked. Homeowners had paid unjust fines, followed arbitrary rules, and accepted her authority because challenging her seemed harder than complying. But once people realized they were not alone, once we organized and supported each other, Patricia's power had evaporated quickly. The recall election had not even been close. When residents were given a real choice, they overwhelmingly rejected her leadership. The criminal charges had been the final chapter, proof that Patricia had not just been overzealous but actively corrupt. The financial investigation had revealed that her campaign of fines and rules had never really been about property values or community safety. It had been about control and personal enrichment. I received a letter from the Milwaukee Fire Department in August. Captain Andrews wrote to thank me for bringing attention to the issue of HOA overreach regarding fire hydrants. Apparently, my case had prompted the department to conduct outreach to other HOAs in the city, clarifying that hydrant maintenance was a city responsibility and that HOAs should not be requiring residents to clear them. The letter noted that several other Milwaukee HOAs had been making similar demands and had now ceased those policies. My stubborn refusal to shovel one fire hydrant had ended up protecting homeowners across the city. Jennifer Scott, the reporter who had first covered the story, did a follow-up piece in September titled "How One Homeowner's Fight Against His HOA Exposed Corruption and Changed Policy." The article detailed the entire saga from the initial letter to Patricia's guilty plea. Jennifer interviewed several legal experts who praised Wisconsin's HOA oversight laws and anti-SLAPP protections as models for other states. She also quoted Marcus extensively about the importance of homeowners knowing their rights and not being intimidated by HOA threats. The article ended with a quote from me that I thought captured the whole experience. "I never wanted to be in a fight with my HOA. I just wanted to live in my house without being hassled over things that were not my responsibility." But once Patricia started down this path, I realized it was not really about a fire hydrant. It was about whether one person could abuse their power without consequences. I am glad we proved the answer is no. The new HOA board asked me to join as a member at large in October. I was initially hesitant, having had more than enough of HOA politics, but Gerald convinced me that good people needed to stay involved to prevent future Patricias from taking over. I agreed to serve a one-year term. The experience was completely different from anything under Patricia's leadership. We focused on real issues like maintaining common areas, organizing neighborhood events, and keeping residents informed. We did not issue a single fine during my entire term because we treated people like adults and communicated clearly about expectations. The Riverside Meadows community thrived under the new board. Property values actually increased, not because of strict rule enforcement, but because people wanted to live in a neighborhood where the HOA was reasonable and competent. Several houses sold that fall and winter, and I heard from real estate agents that buyers specifically asked about the HOA situation because of the media coverage. When they learned Patricia was gone and the new board was rational, it became a selling point rather than a liability. By the time winter rolled around again, nearly a year after the first letter had arrived, Milwaukee was hit with another major snowstorm. I shoveled my driveway and sidewalk as always, then stood looking at the fire hydrant on the corner of my property. The city snow crews came through the next day, clearing hydrants throughout the neighborhood as they always had. I watched them work, thinking about how much trouble could have been avoided if Patricia had just done 5 minutes of research before sending out her demands. But then, I reflected, people like Patricia were not really interested in research or facts. They were interested in control. The fire hydrant had never been about safety. It had been about asserting dominance and collecting fines. I was grateful that chapter of my life was over. My only regret was that it had taken so long and required so much effort to resolve what should have been a simple matter. But I also recognized that the fight had been worth it, not just for me but for everyone in the community who had been suffering under Patricia's tyrannical leadership. The following spring, I was approached by a homeowner rights organization that wanted to use my story in their educational materials about HOA disputes. They asked if I would be willing to speak at a conference in Madison about my experience. I agreed, and in April I found myself standing before a room of about 200 people, mostly homeowners and some attorneys, talking about fire hydrants and HOA overreach. The response was overwhelming. Person after person approached me afterward to share their own HOA horror stories and to thank me for fighting back against Patricia. One woman told me her HOA had tried to fine her for having the wrong type of mailbox, even though it was the same mailbox that had been there when she bought the house. A man described being threatened with liens for parking his car on the street overnight when there was no rule against it. The stories went on, a catalog of petty tyranny and abuse of power. What struck me most was how many people felt helpless. They believed they had no choice but to comply with whatever their HOA demanded, no matter how unreasonable. They did not realize they had rights and options. I made it a point to connect these people with resources. Attorneys who specialized in HOA law, state agencies that provided oversight, homeowner advocacy organizations. I could not fight everyone's battles, but I could at least point them in the right direction. Marcus told me months later that he had gotten at least a dozen new clients who had contacted him after hearing me speak or reading about my case. He thanked me for the business and joked that I should get a referral fee. By the time summer arrived, the fire hydrant incident had become something I occasionally mentioned at parties or when meeting new neighbors. A war story about the time I fought my HOA and won. The actual fire hydrant was still there on the corner of my property, freshly painted red by the city maintenance crew. Every time I looked at it, I thought about that first letter and how easily I could have just grabbed a shovel and cleared the snow. It would have taken maybe 15 minutes, and I could have avoided months of conflict, thousands in legal fees, and immense stress. But I would not have exposed Patricia's corruption. I would not have helped reform HOA policies across Milwaukee. I would not have brought the community together or given other homeowners the courage to stand up for their rights. Sometimes the easy path is not the right path. Sometimes you have to stand your ground, even over something as seemingly trivial as a fire hydrant, because principles matter. I never heard from Patricia again after her guilty plea. I assumed she had left the neighborhood, though I was not certain. Her house had a for sale sign in the yard for months before finally selling in late summer. I did not attend the closing or make any effort to see her leave. I was content to let that chapter close without any final confrontation. The Riverside Meadows Homeowner Defense Committee officially disbanded in August, its mission accomplished. We had a small celebration at the community center, grilling burgers and sharing stories about the recall campaign and the various battles with Patricia. It felt good to mark the end of that difficult period. Gerald raised his beer in a toast. To Isaac, who would not shovel a fire hydrant and accidentally saved the neighborhood. Everyone laughed and clinked their bottles and glasses. Susan added, and to all of us for having the guts to stand up together. That felt right. It had never really been about me alone. Yes, I had been the initial flashpoint, but the change had come because dozens of people decided enough was enough. We had supported each other, collected signatures, attended meetings, and refused to be intimidated. That collective action had made all the difference. As the evening wore on and the sun set over Milwaukee, I felt genuinely content for the first time in over a year. The weight of the HOA conflict had lifted. I could just be a regular homeowner again, mowing my lawn and shoveling my driveway without worrying about vindictive letters and arbitrary fines. I thought about the journey from that January morning when the certified letter arrived to this summer evening surrounded by neighbors who had become friends through shared adversity. It had been exhausting and frustrating, and at times infuriating, but it had also been necessary. The fire hydrant still stood on the corner of my property, a silent monument to a battle over principle. The city would continue to maintain it, as was proper. I would continue to live my life without shoveling it, as was my right. And somewhere, I hoped, Patricia Brennan was learning that power without accountability does not last, and that communities are stronger than any one person's desire for control. Whether she actually learned those lessons, I would never know. But I had learned mine, and I had helped others learn theirs, and that felt like enough. Winter came around again, as it always does in Wisconsin. Another snowstorm hit in late December, dumping a fresh layer of white across Riverside Meadows. I bundled up and went outside with my shovel, clearing my driveway and sidewalk with practiced efficiency. When I finished, I leaned on my shovel and looked at the fire hydrant. The top was barely visible above the snow. I smiled, went inside, and called the non-emergency city line to report it needed clearing. They sent someone out that afternoon. I watched from my window as the city worker efficiently cleared the snow away from the hydrant, making sure it was accessible. He waved to me when he finished, and I waved back. That was how it was supposed to work. That was how it would continue to work, now that Patricia was gone and reasonable people were in charge. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down in my living room, warm and content. Outside, snow continued to fall gently, covering the neighborhood in pristine white. The fire hydrant stood clear and accessible on the corner, ready if it was ever needed. Everything was exactly as it should be.